Yeah, certainly if you didn't hear, certainly want to pray for our country, the elections, our elected leaders. No matter what the final result, certainly we know that God's in control. We'll even look a little bit in that in our lesson today in Daniel. But yes, absolutely, certainly want to keep our nation and elected leaders in prayer as well. Yep, Mike and Beverly. I think Mike is doing a lot better. Certainly recovery, so just kind of continue to keep him in prayer and all of them. Yes. Okay. All right. So like Michelle's Aunt Barbara, her Uncle Bill passed away. So certainly just remember them in prayer. Certainly comfort for the family. Oh. Yeah, Jody's mom, she's been having some physical issues, so certainly just kind of keep her in prayer. Back issues and some other things, and just for wisdom on some decisions that she may need to make. Certainly she lives alone, 10 acres of desert land, so she may need to make a different plan for things. So just kind of physically and just kind of help her make the decisions the Lord would want her to make. All right, let's go to the Lord in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your love. Certainly we're thankful that you care about each and every single one of us, about our spiritual condition, our physical condition. So, Lord, you tell us that we should cast our cares upon you because you care for us. Lord, certainly we want to think specifically about just a few things this morning. Certainly like Brother Tom, Miss Rosie, certainly Tom in his recovery, and then his rehab. Certainly you know what needs to take place within the body and the healing, and certainly those that are attending to them. Lord, I pray that you would just work your will, just give him comfort and relief from the pain. And I pray that if it be your will, certainly that it would be a successful surgery and to try to relieve a lot of those issues that he's been having. Certainly for Michelle's aunt, and certainly as her Uncle Bill passed away, certainly pray that you would provide comfort to the family in a difficult time, no matter the age or the circumstances. Certainly it's always a trying time, but I pray that you would just provide comfort there. Certainly want to think about our nation, the elections coming up, the elected leadership. Lord, we know that the heart of the king is in your hands. You raise kings up and you take kings down, and elected leaders for that. Lord, I pray that you would just work your will in our nation and certainly in our own hearts and lives, that we would certainly be honoring to you, and that the policies that they would put forth would certainly be honoring for you. For Jody's mom, I pray that you would just be with her as she's dealing with some physical issues in her back and just needing to make some decisions. I pray that you would provide wisdom and relief there. Be with us today as we look in your word at the book of Daniel. I pray that our hearts would be open to hearing what you have for us there. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we've made it through Ezekiel. So now we're going to be moving just right on over into Daniel. Daniel was a contemporary with Ezekiel. I believe Daniel probably just a little bit older as he was taken first. But obviously just a few key facts that we're going to be going through the book of Daniel over the next, I think it's 5 or 6 lessons. Certainly Daniel is the last of the major prophetic books. Certainly comes right after Ezekiel. The time frame for the book of Daniel is it covers about 70 years from 605 BC to about 536 BC. And we spent a lot of time, obviously, when we've been looking at Ezekiel, where he did a lot of ministering to the exiles, those who had left or been specifically taken from Jerusalem. So unlike Ezekiel, Daniel probably really didn't have much of a direct ministry with all of the exiles. He, as we'll get into, really obviously was working up in the government based on his upbringing. And so even though he didn't really work directly with the exiles, the Jewish people knew who he was, certainly by his testimony and his writings. And so let's kind of delve right on into it. Really, as we look into it and we think about Daniel, probably one of the more popular major prophets. We know a lot of stories about Daniel and his life. There's a lot of lessons that are taught to young people, teenagers, children growing up, just about as we learn about how as young men or young people, they purpose in their heart to do from a very young age. And so I know there's a lot of things taught, certainly to children. So one of the more popular and easier to understand prophets and stories, certainly about the wisdom of following in God's ways right from the very start. So anyway, and so certainly because they followed him, certainly God exalted them. So let's go ahead. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 1, and we'll just start off in verse 1. So it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." So, leading up to really verse 1, what happens in really about the year 608 BC, we've got the Egyptians. They come, they attack Judah, and in the battle, King Josiah is killed. So, pretty common, certainly in those days. You come in, you take over, you conquer a nation. You generally will just sort of set up somebody because usually whoever the conquering army isn't looking to move in. They just want to take over the land and they want to get paid. So they installed just the kings who they just killed. They installed his son, gets a little bit of legitimacy to everybody else, and now they are essentially just a vassal state of Egypt at that time. So a few years later, 605 BC, that's certainly when Chaldeans come through with Nebuchadnezzar, and he's looking certainly to enlarge his basically vast domain, and comes up against the Egyptians, and like in the plains of Syria is where the Chaldeans defeat the Egyptians, and then subsequently, because Jerusalem is really just considered an ally by Nebuchadnezzar to them, they siege them. And then they are then compelled, certainly they don't have any way to stand up against that army, to then be their vassal state and to begin to then just pay them tribute. And so the Bible specifically talks about certainly the things that are taken. It's interesting that as you look at it, verse 2, it talks about, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand." So Bible makes it really clear that was God's will at that time. They were going to lose. This wasn't like, oh, they just should have prayed some. They were under judgment. That was God's will at that time for them. They were going to be taken. And so as quite customary, they're going to get paid. And so certainly in those days, they want gold, they want silver, they want treasures. And so of course, you're going to end up having things taken from the temple, gold and silver, which, they need to pay them. And so that's, by this point, they've already been taken over by Egypt, and now they're getting taken over by the Chaldeans. What's left? Well, we've got some temple things. So, of course, they're going to end up paying with those. But also, you've got a secondary reason besides just being gold and silver for why they're going to give relics or just things from the temple. It was quite customary that an invading army would come. Every country had their god or their gods, plural. And so, you defeated another country, that must mean your God is greater than their God that they were just worshiping. So what do? Well, you go take stuff from their temples, whatever it is, and you then take it back. The Bible specifically says that it carried it back to Shinar, to the house of his God. And all you do, you've got your God set up here in the front, and you say, hey, here's an offering. Let's throw down these people's junk, that we just took from them, just to specifically rub it in. Which, our country's greater, our God's greater, look at what we've done. And so, and all the people certainly, all the Chaldeans would say, it would just reiterate, yep, the God we've been worshiping, look at that. We just took over another group, and we just threw their junk right at his feet. So now as we move into verse 3, it says, "And the king spake to Ashpenaz," I've been practicing that, "the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed unto them a provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and Azariah Abednego." So we're in 605 BC, and so there were actually several of these essentially paying tribute to the Chaldeans. So the first one being obviously the first time that they come and they take over Jerusalem. So in 605, that's when Daniel and the group of choice, it comes right out and says the choice young men, and we'll kind of delve into a little bit of them in just a minute, but they're the choice young men. The second one ends up occurring about 8 years later in 597 BC, which that's when Ezekiel and really a whole lot of skilled labor is really what was being taken kind of the next time around was taken. And then later on at the eventual destruction of Jerusalem in 586, another large group was taken at that time. So in the first wave of who gets taken when they're being paid tribute is you want to establish your dominance over a country that you've just taken over. You start drawing from the royalty of whatever that country is. One, you got less people to then rise up against you, less leaders to then be trying to cause problems for you, just practical applications. And then you're going to start taking these people and you're going to start training them in your ways, so they can serve you eventually. And you would take the royalty, certainly because if you want them to serve in your government or kind of be in your court and establish dominance over another country, but you need them to have kind of the proper cultural and educational backgrounds, because these people are going to eventually be representing the king and serving him in direct capacity. They need to be the best of the country. Now the children, when it talks about that, they would be, in this case, young men. They probably somewhere ranging between the age of 10 and 20 can be children. A lot of them would then end up being kind of in the prime time would be kind of like the mid-teens would be who they would want the best. Bible specifically talks about that they needed to be without physical defect or blemish. They were to be well favored. So this wasn't, they wanted the best looking kids. These people are going to get trained by the king. The king doesn't want to look at any ugly people. So, unlike you're stuck with me. The king, he gets a choice. And he says, hey, I only want the best looking. Because anybody, from a governmental standpoint, if you're the king or the leader, you've got your people who were kind of a little bit lower than you. They're going to end up, they're representing you. The king at that time wants to show his greatness. And hey, I only have the best looking people. Certainly, he wants them to be well favored and the best looking, but also he wants them highly intelligent. That certainly key for him, because in those days, of course, they didn't have communication like we've got today. So eventually there was going to be a time that whoever these princes or royalty, after their training, and they would be loyal to him, they were going to be sent out into some effect. So certainly he would need them to be highly intelligent to carry on a lot of different duties. First thing, it talks about wisdom. And so, of course, that's going to stress the practical side of knowledge. They needed to have a breadth of knowledge, so they needed to have wide understanding of many topics. And then, of course, the depth of knowledge, certainly the ability to be able to get to the root of matters. Eventually, as they're going to be leaders far away, they need to be able to discern and get down really to the root of things. So they're going to be serving in his court, and so they're going to have an extensive training program. Certainly, that would have been the program at that time in the known world. If you were selected, or in this case, taken, and to be in that program, I'm sure there would be Chaldeans who would want to be in the program, certainly even though they were natives, but only the best were going to end up being put through the program. We've got, like in our country, when you think of, hey, what's the best school or the best academy that you can get into, you've got essentially what might be considered the top academies might be, from the government standpoint, might be like the military academies, where you've got, we've actually got 5 of them. Does anybody know what our 5 military academies are? So you've got U.S. Military Academy for the Army, the Naval Academy, Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, that's 3. Coast Guard Academy, and then there's one more, and actually I didn't even remember this, I kind of looked it up last night. We got one more academy. I won't make you wait too long, since Space Academy is actually hooked up with part of the Air Force Academy. That is a good thought. The U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. I'd forgotten all about that one. So anyway, in these, it's certainly a little different scenario, of course, in these days where it's volunteers who are trying to get in there, but those will be considered elite, in this case, military universities. Young people are doing all kinds of stuff to try to get into them, making calls, writing letters, doing 50 extra. It would be the same type of thing here. If you were able to get into the King's extensive training program, you know that to a certain extent you had arrived if you were able to get there. Now, certainly, yes, those who've been conquered and were pulled in as princes that were going to go through the program, yes, they did not have a choice. However, we know that it would have been the top education that you could have gotten in the world at that time. Because they were going to end up studying, certainly the language of the Chaldeans. If you're going to be the most powerful, empire, you need to speak their language. So they would be learning that. And then, of course, old languages, they would teach them that. It would also go through astronomy, astrology, mathematics, mythology, agriculture, and architecture. Again, they would be very well-rounded young men who were going to be in leadership positions and sent really, in this case, across the world. So they would be highly intelligent, and certainly the king, if he's going to invest all this time and effort in their education, and certainly he wants them to look good, he's going to give them the best foods. So, of course, the king is going to eat the very best that there is. So he's going to make sure that his prize students are also going to be going through and getting just the same type of food that he does. And so, of those chosen, as we kind of start to take a look at this, of those chosen from Jerusalem to be taken out, because it talks about, hey, we want the choice young men. Of those chosen, we only know the names of the 4. The Bible doesn't give us any record of anyone else who was taken. Certainly there were more than 4, but these are the only ones, I'd say by design, that we actually even know who they were. Certainly they were, as we kind of will look into, they end up making some good choices for the Lord, and those are the ones that we know about. So it talks about how they were given new names once they got there. You've got practical reasons for why you end up getting a new name when you get to the new country. One, certainly the Chaldeans, they wanted them to kind of start severing ties, with their homeland. You're going to pull them in. You really want to really start making them part of your group and part of your government. They need to start cutting those ties religiously. Certainly, it was quite common in history that certainly they would be given names. One, that would be honoring God. And so, Babylonians wanted, hey, we need you to have names, and it would be very quite common for them to have names honoring their gods. So then they were given names that would honor their gods. Certainly, another reason you're going to want these people, since they're going to be part of your government, they need to have names that really fit in the context of that language. Certainly, we know that you got quite common names in the English language, William and Robert, but you get to some other country, let's say in the Middle East, they've got a whole different language. They don't have a lot of Williams and Roberts over there. It's just the practicality of it. And then kind of, I would say finally, or at least another one, just direct assimilation. If all of a sudden now people you knew, they now have a new name, and other people, certainly because they were going to be working with Chaldeans and other people, hey, we all just have the same kind of name. We're just kind of part of this culture now. The old culture is gone. We're now part of this one. So now, as we move on into chapter 8, so let's kind of see where we really get into the meat of it, and where it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall he make me endanger my head to the king." So, as we look at it, the food was just not going to be acceptable to a devout Israelite. Undoubtedly, they would have meats that were forbidden to them, first off, and then almost certainly they would have been meats that would then have also been part of some type of sacrifice to their gods, which, of course, was a false god, and he didn't want to have any part of that. So, you think about it from the practical standpoint of your nation's been conquered, you've really been taken in exile, and the king says, you're now in this program, and you're going to eat this food. And you say, I don't want to eat that food. When of that gets back to the king, it could be very easy for him to just say, I don't need troublemakers, you're done. Get out of it, go kill them. And that'll be the end of it. So that was just a very serious thing to refuse the king of anything. So, but Daniel, he was purposing in his heart that he wasn't going to defile himself. He was going to obey God and follow God's instructions. But interesting, he was making his request politely. Daniel had been found kind of in favor with him. And so I don't know the time frame or how fast, but certainly God had obviously worked both in Daniel's life, but certainly I would say in like the prince of the eunuch's heart as well, because he had already found a measure of favor where he was interested in at least listening to him. It doesn't give us, he tells us that he had the conversation with him. He didn't just say, sir, could I not have this? Get back to your plate. No. He actually had a discussion with him. He's like, I'd like to help you, but I don't want to lose my head. So, and really, if you think about it, in this guy's whole history, he's probably never, ever had anybody come up and say, excuse me, Mr. Ashpenaz, could I send back the lobster tail and the ribeye and the filet mignon and the loaded baked potato? And maybe I could have something else to do. How about the bowl for the salad bar and a glass of water? Could I just have that today? What? I don't know what they'd eat back then. That would be, but that's just what I would imagine would be what the king would eat. So Daniel, he wanted to help him, but certainly, and hey, honestly, who can blame the prince? That's a little too risky. So verse 11, it then tells us, says, Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. So very simply, we've got just the proposal to what would essentially be Daniel and all of their, if you want to call it their dorm, if you've been in the dorm life of any kind, you'll have somebody ultimately in charge, but then you may have some kind of floor manager, floor leader, whatever guy who's kind of a little more in direct control of your daily life and what's going on. So Daniel goes to his immediate supervisor, if you will, and says, hey, how about this little proposal? Give us 10 days, and then you just kind of decide, from what's going on, kind of what you see, and then just decide from there if this is great. If you've ever been in a job or situation where you've got a relationship built up with, let's say, your immediate supervisor, and the company's got, whether it's a direct company policy or just a general way that things have always been done, and you know that, hey, you know what, this can also be accomplished in a different way than it's ever been done before. And if you had that relationship built up with, say, an immediate supervisor, you could say, hey, you know what, I believe that this task can be accomplished in this way, and honestly, it would really work out a lot better for me. And they could say, well, listen, you seem to be able to get everything done. Well, give that a shot. And if it works out, then we're good. But if it doesn't, then we have to go back to how we've been doing it, and we just have to do that. And so in this case, he had built up that relationship. Certainly, it talks about how the prince of eunuchs, he had found favor with him. Easily to assume that certainly Melzar was the same way. He had already built up that relationship with him and found favor with him. To even be given the chance, again, it wasn't, Daniel, get back to your studies. Come on, don't bother me with this. No. He had that relationship saying, well, all right, 10 days. Let's just give that a little bit of time. So verse 15 tells us, and at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. So he accepted it, and they had only vegetables and water to drink for 10 days. And in 10 days, they appeared healthier and stronger. Must have been the greatest diet in the history of mankind. To 10 days, wow. No, certainly Daniel didn't have his trust in whatever vegetables were coming from the garden and some fantastic water. Certainly he knew that if he honored the Lord, that the Lord was going to reward that and honor him. And you even looking back on it, it's like, well, how can you just look better in 10 days? Just 10 days. Usually you even get on a diet. 10 days is generally not enough to hardly do anything. A lot of people, you lose weight, and you've been losing weight for 3 months, and then somebody says, did you lose a pound or two? You look pretty good. Like, oh, yeah, I lost 20. And whatever. 10 days. So certainly it's quite obvious that God was working. And God was honoring these four who were trying to take a stand for him in what would be an extremely wicked society. And they said, hey, we do not want to defile ourselves. We want to honor what God has for us. And so he saw it. He saw the results. And it's like, well, shoot, if you can look this fantastic in 10 days, go right ahead, because certainly all that's going to do is, in the end, make him look better to the prince and ultimately to the king, which, hey, anything you could do in these days to look better in the eyes of the king, you did it at all costs. So verse 17 tells us, and as for these four children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So Bible really just kind of zips forward a few years in one verse and just kind of says, hey, they were rewarded. Certainly, the Lord didn't just help out their physical condition. Certainly, he would have aided them in their learning, of the languages, learning, and all the different topics and subjects that they would go through. Now, undoubtedly, I would say that Daniel and they would have been They would have worked hard to study hard, to make sure that they were applying themselves. So this wasn't a, we passed that one test, we don't have to eat the king's meat, cool, now we can kick back because, look, the Lord made us look good in 10 days. No, they would certainly have applied themselves to do all that they could in their power, and the Lord would continue to bless them. And talks about giving them skill and knowledge on it. And Daniel notes that it was God, who had blessed him and had given him that. First Daniel talks about how he gave them knowledge to be able to discern what was true, gave them skill in learning, which means that they had then mastered all the things that the Chaldeans had sent them and have really had insight into all of these subjects. And then they were given wisdom to be able to apply all the things that they had learned, to be able just to apply them into a practical level. And so we've got, and the Chaldeans, as you really think about it, they were wanting to bring a lot of these foreigners in and get them at a young age into their elite education, because they would understand, hey, if we get them young and we put them through our education system, then, hey, they're going to be ours, because we're going to be able to get them convinced at that age where they're formulating opinions and they're getting their own ideas. Hey, we want them to be ours. They would have their education would be intertwined with a lot of idolatry, superstitions, all of those things, which to a foreigner coming in, starting to look at that and saying, well, that looks kind of weird. Well, if you hammer them long enough, pretty soon, they just start saying, well, it's what everybody else here does. And look, they did conquer us. That must be. So there's a lot of that's been going on for years. And it would be easy to just say, I need to go along to get along. I'm in their country. I need to just start doing whatever they do to save my own life. But no, the Bible talks about how Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they ended up coming out of it. Their faith was still intact. They were taking the stand, and the Lord was still rewarding them for it. And as we go through and look at it, let's see here. I just lost my place. Oh, Daniel. Kind of forgot about that. So Daniel was given additional insight. So not only were they going to be highly intelligent, God also had given Daniel really the gift to have understanding and visions and dreams. And as it moves forward throughout the book, this certainly becomes a much larger role for Daniel kind of in his life. So now, in verse 18, we're getting to big time, where it says, now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was not found. Let me try that verse one more time. I did read it a time or two. Verse 19, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in the realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So graduation day, and it's safe to assume that all of them would be in the area 18, 19, 20 years old. They would certainly be late teens, really probably early 20s at the most. And so you then get a personal interview from the king of the greatest empire of the known world. And that would be pretty, tough. These days, if you were going to go work for a Fortune 500 company, unless you were applying for executive vice president of whatever, you most likely weren't meeting the president of the CEO of the company. You'd get some way down mid-level manager guy, because that's where you would be at. Well, in this case, the king of the greatest empire of the known world is now interviewing you to see how you did and to see how you might be applied and how he's going to apply you now into his government. And so 4 of them stood out way above the rest. And, the king, he would want to have the top people, even from foreign lands, serving him as a sign to others, saying, I took over these people, now they work directly for me, and look at what they're doing. It was just kind of part of, just kind of showing off, hey, here, look at me, look at my grandeur. I mean, look what I've been able to do. They're all part of my empire. And so the cream of the crop were obviously, kind of from this graduating class, were obviously Daniel and his 4 friends. And, through the interview process, it revealed, more than just superiority over the classmates. It even went so far as to say that they were 10 times greater than his magicians and astrologers. Certainly, when you look at these type of things in the Bible, saying that somebody is 10 times better, certainly we don't have any specific measurement of saying 10 times better. You think about also when the Bible talks about how much are we supposed to forgive somebody? 70 times 7. It really is just it's not, okay, let's count until we get to 490. No, it's just so much better that it wasn't even close. 10 times smarter than all the magicians. It's just like the difference. They were so much better than everybody he'd ever had. It was obvious that they were way better. It wasn't even close. Now the magicians of those days, they were considered part of the, really what would be kind of like the priestly group. For the Chaldeans, you think of like in Jesus' time where they had scribes, who could certainly be writing down, the Old Testament and transcribing them over. Some of the magicians of these days, they were certainly steeped in a lot of, really would be like sorcery, and they would say how they could commune with the dead. But certainly with all of these with these magicians dealing in a lot of superstitions, I don't know how hard it would be to try to be 10 times smarter than them, but nonetheless, the king could tell that with these 4, that they were heads and shoulders and way better than them. And then probably one of the most understated verses that we'll see today in verse 21, it says, and Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of Cyrus. Basically, Daniel just summed up his 70 years of service in one verse. Well, I worked there for 70 years. So certainly not somebody who was proud of what had just been referred to as being 10 times greater than any of the magicians or astrologers, heads and shoulders above them, way better than any of the classmates. Certainly Daniel was humble and just kind of gives us hey, this is how long I served there. So certainly he was an administrator and a counselor to kings. None of them believed in God. None of them were going to be believers. They were kings that were, in many cases, quite wicked. But he found a way to serve the Lord. God had called him to that service. It's kind of the note, kind of the book talks about, Daniel. It's a fantastic example of a full-time service to God in a secular position. It was certainly clear that Daniel had a heart for the Lord, even though he wasn't like Ezekiel, ministering directly to the exiles, maybe holding, doing different functions from the temple or trying to act as a priest. Daniel was a prophet, and certainly, but God had a specific mission and calling for him that wasn't directly full-time service at a church or something like that. And so, it's fantastic what the Lord can do with those who are called. And that's really the calling for all of us. There's only so many people that can be the pastor or an assistant pastor, but certainly God calls us all. He's going to call us, whether it's a field here or whether it's a field out in the world, we're still called to serve and to honor him and to obey and follow in his ways. And we'll continue to look at the ways that Daniel did that as we move on. But certainly from the beginning and early on, Daniel was able to purpose in his heart, and certainly God rewarded that. And, and today, now, God still calls us to honor him and to be where he calls and to be a light for him. So we're probably not going to be given the ability to interpret dreams and visions, but God still will reward faithfulness to him. Any comments or anything before we close?